All right, hi boys. We're just going to very quickly go through price ceilings and price floors in this video. I'm going to go through it in our video conference as well, but I just wanted to make a recording of it so that you can all refer to it later on as well, because it does become quite a relevant part to your assessment task. So I'm just going to skip through. That's the bit of the syllabus that we are referring to. Essentially, what happens in terms of price ceilings is that we know that the government needs to intervene in some way. For certain goods and services, it's not efficient, or it doesn't provide socially optimum outcomes for the government to for the market to be free. It means that some people miss out on potentially goods and services that are essential, and the government deems that they're necessary. So the government does intervene in this particular case. So the first one that we're looking at is called a price ceiling. Now, when you usually think of a price ceiling, you think of the ceiling, the roof on the top of your house. Now, if you think that, you need to think opposite. When we talk about price ceiling, the actual line happens on the bottom of the graph. So this here is our price ceiling. So even though you'd assume it'd be on the top, it actually falls on the bottom. And I've had students tell me before that they think that it's a ceiling because you can actually, this whole thing looks like a bit of a house here. So when you put it at the bottom, it looks like a house, and that line draws the ceiling in that instance. So what we're going to be looking at is what happens when the government essentially puts a maximum price that can be charged for a particular good or service. So in this case, we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity over here. That's the price in the good or service that if the market was left to run free, the demanders would pay that much, suppliers would receive that much, and there would be a quantity provided. Now, if the government thinks that this is too expensive, they set the maximum price below equilibrium to have an effect. So we call it P max, the maximum price, and always remember that it is below equilibrium to have an effect. And essentially what that means is that at this price now, it's significantly cheaper than the equilibrium price. So based on our law of demand, as the price goes down, it means that demand will rise. So we can see that if this was our equilibrium price here initially, as soon as you drop the price, you actually have an increase in demand, and that's now here. So the quantity demanded is now at QC. But because the price has gone down, based on our law of supply, we know that supply goes down. So while demand expands in this way to move to this new point, supply contracts to move to this point, which is less than equilibrium. So they're willing to actually supply less because it's now cheaper. That's the price they're receiving is going to be cheaper. So what we're left with in this specific scenario is that we have more quantity being demanded and less quantity being supplied. And as a result, this little gap in between here, this QC minus QP, so that's that little gap that we have here. This means we have excess demand. We have less demand. We have more demand than we have supply. So people are going to miss out in this particular instance. And what the government might do, separate to that, is they might provide it themselves in order to supplement what the good or service is, or they might import it in from another country if that's the particular case. Now, examples that we can look at are rental price controls and staple food items. So some staple food items that people need, the government might set the price below equilibrium so then everyone has access to it, or also rental price controls. And there's actually a lot of calls for rental price controls right now with the whole coronavirus. That means that the rental price, because so many people are dependent on rent prices because housing prices have become so out of reach for many people, then we have a situation whereby the price of rent is decreased below equilibrium, so more people are able to house themselves and rent, but at that same point you'll have less suppliers wanting to rent out or lease out their properties because they're not going to be receiving as much money. So there's some examples. Now, when we're looking at price floors, that's the exact opposite of a price ceiling. So when we said the price ceiling was a price below equilibrium, even though we think ceiling's up the top, the line actually goes on the bottom. In this particular scenario, price floor, you think the floor's on the bottom, but now our price is on the top. And we call it our P minimum. Essentially what it means is that the government will set the price above equilibrium. So if free markets were to roam, we would have our equilibrium point here at PE and QE, and that's how the market would sort itself out. But these particular goods or services, the government deems that they should be paid, there should be more given for these particular goods services. Mostly they would do this to actually support the people supplying the good or service. And a really good example of this is minimum wage and agricultural products, where the government feels like because farmers may be going through a really rough time and there's lots of droughts, they enforce that people have to pay more for their goods and services just to make sure that those farmers get more money. And the same would be for minimum wage. So the suppliers of labor and labor resources would be given extra money. So with minimum wage, there's a base wage that's set above equilibrium so that suppliers of labor can get a basic living wage that they can afford basic goods and services. If we let the market run free, we would have a situation like in China where there's like people getting paid less than $2 an hour, which is ridiculous. You can't have a good living standard. So in order to avoid poverty and unequal distribution of income, the government will impose something like this. Now, what happens in this particular scenario is that you will see that when the price is set above equilibrium, the price has risen. So we've gone from PE to P-min, and based on our supply, if the price increases, then we're going to have more people who are willing to supply it. So we can see that supply has actually expanded and has now moved to QP. There's an expansion there. But based on demand, as the price rises, we have less people demanding it. So we will see a contraction in demand moving to QC. So in this particular scenario, our gap that we have, which is in between here, which is our QP minus our QC, this is a situation where we have excess supply. Because suppliers are receiving a higher price for it, there's going to be lots of supply in the market, but because now it's more expensive, the quantity demanded is going to decrease. So in this way, the government is able to redistribute money from buyers to sellers because the sellers who are supplying now get the money as a result of that. And so that is your price floor. Like I said, we've got minimum wage, agricultural products. More recently, we've got the Northern Territory imposing price floors for wine in order to stop alcoholism and issues that are happening in that state around that. But yes, that's the essentials of price floors and price ceiling.